All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to this month's edition of the Beyond Compliance webinar and podcast series. I'm Brian Sharp with SafetyChain Software, and we're really glad you're all able to carve out a little bit of time in your very busy days to join us. And we are excited to delve into a topic that has definitely been dominating the news. It's certainly been a hot topic in and around the folks that we work with and are talking to out in the market, and I think by the response we saw to the webinar topic, it's on your minds as well. So we're going to be digging in today to CBD. We're going to talk about regulations and some of the real critical updates, trends, and even some of the strategies that are being deployed out there in the food and beverage world. And the idea here today is, we can just scratch the surface, but there's no doubt there's a lot of confusion, certainly a lot of change. And what we're really looking to do is set the record straight in some real key areas as you begin some of your planning and consideration around this topic. And it's interesting to say the least. So we are bringing in the big guns for this one, and I will introduce our expert, Eric Edmunds, here in just a moment. But we are really glad you're with us today, and should be a lot of fun. For those of you that may be new, we want to welcome all of you for joining us the first time. We see a lot of new faces, and that's always excited as our community continues to grow. We started this almost 2 years ago as a means to provide just kind of a strategic, very tactical, hands-on approach to topics that are going on with food safety and compliance, but all the way into operations and continuous improvement. So we bring in thought leaders, experts, practitioners, folks that are doing this work and sharing what's working and sharing tools and ideas. And that's what our hope is that you leave here today with some real tangible things that you can take away and apply to your companies, but also to give you access to some of the best in the business. And that certainly is the case here today. So we welcome your ideas for topics. This is actually a great example of a topic that's been asked for, or even presenters, or if you have a topic you'd like to present on, we're always open. So we're glad you're here, and we'll continue bringing it as long as you keep showing up. As the sponsor of the series, something we're really proud of, and again, bringing this as a value add to our community. You're going to hear a lot about strategy, a lot about regulatory things, particularly here today. Where we help and support is on the technology side. So as you think about how to deploy new programs, how to manage all the different programs in food safety, improving your QA processes, or even all that tedious, painful supplier compliance you have to go through. That's where we really help companies do that faster, better, and easier with our cloud-based system. So if there's an opportunity to improve what you're doing with technology, we certainly would love an opportunity to speak with you about it and show you a little bit about what we're up to over at SafetyChain. A few housekeeping items here to just keep in mind as we get started. One, we do try to present these as more of a conversation, right? So there's a lot of great content today, and one of the things that Eric did in advance was put together the slides in a way that could be really helpful as a reference tool. So we do have slides. Those will be shared at the end, as I'll note here. But one of the things we always encourage you to do is to ask questions. One of the great advantages to having some of these experts in here. We'll monitor those questions. You'll notice that only the panelists are displayed. So when you send those questions, they'll come straight into myself and Ann on our team, and we'll monitor those at the end. We will do our best to get to the Q&A at the end, depending on how things go. One of the things that Eric has offered is if we are unable to get to all the questions, we'll take those offline and make sure they get answered for you. So bear with us on that, but please fire away as you think of them, send them across. That's usually the best way to do that. First question, most common question I'll get out of the way up front is, yes, we are recording, and yes, you'll get access to not just the replay, but also the deck, as I had mentioned. And we'll typically get those out within a few days of completion here. And last but not least, we are on, webinar tools. Sometimes they get a little wonky. So if you have any audio issues, there are two ways to dial in, either by phone or you can log on with your computer audio. If one's not working, I know it sounds pretty easy, but just try the other. But we do have some teammates behind the scenes here that can help you. If you have a problem, you can use the chat box there to hit us up there. So with that, we're going to dive in because we got a lot to get to, and we certainly want to try and leave some time here. So as I mentioned, our training topic this month is around CBD regulations, critical updates, trends, and strategies food companies need to know. And I'm very pleased to bring across who's been a fan favorite on our FSMA Fridays, let's say that fast, Eric Edmunds from the Acheson Group. So Eric, I'm going to first make sure you can hear me okay, and welcome.
Yep, I can hear you just fine, Brian, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, no, this has been great. And we touched on this on FSMA Fridays, and for those of you that aren't familiar with Eric, it was an extremely popular topic, but he is a Director of Food Safety over at the Acheson Group, has a really fascinating background that combines legal, regulatory, and direct food industry experience, and that's where he's helping out with TAG all over the place. In fact, it's tough to track this guy down. But I think also what was interesting is your experience working in the Department of Ag up in Oregon, and you were involved with, rulemaking proceedings and reg policies, but also have a very deep experience in cannabis. So we're for us, in terms of a resource, Eric is the guy that we go to, and we're very grateful to have you as a partner and on our team, and willing to share some stuff here today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. Get out of the way, and let's dig in here.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you very much. Yeah, and just as Brian mentioned, we kind of touched base on CBD regulations earlier in the year and decided it would be a good opportunity to dig a little deeper and kind of give a little bit more of an overview with some of the same background, just because while a lot of the initial framework that we discussed previously is in place, a lot is constantly changing in the world of hemp and CBD and cannabis in general. So this one, I'll have some overview of where people are getting CBD, their regulatory background in the United States, various responsibilities of federal agencies. In the last year, the DEA has been taken out of the hemp atmosphere in a big way due to the 2018 Farm Bill, but the FDA and USDA are still really involved, and there's a lot of movement going along in both of those agencies. And then just with the overall federal regulatory landscape of cannabis, there are a lot of various state programs and regulations that changes from neighboring states, from east to west, and so on. And although enforcement of different regulations in a lot of senses has been fairly discretionary, especially on the federal level, there are some issues to be aware of when you're entering this market with a CBD product or ingredient, or just general hemp production. And so I'll give some considerations at the end for things to consider and watch out for as you enter this production or industry area. So just to start off, cannabis, hemp, THC, and CBD. All in all, cannabis and hemp are the same plant, just with different characteristics due to ways they've been bred and grown over time. But that's why hemp is having such a huge emergence right now within the food industry and the cosmetic industries of a variety, due to some legal changes at the federal level and at the state levels that vary from your typical recreational adult use cannabis laws in states or medicinal cannabis laws in different states, and is moving towards a more federally accepted, federally approved industry that will likely, over the next couple of years, depending on how fast certain things move, become even bigger in the United States. So the main focus of both cannabis and hemp end up being this delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, the THC, which is the psychoactive ingredient in cannabis that would give the person the typical high, whether you're ingesting an edible or inhaling a smokable form of the product. And cannabidiol is CBD, is the one that we'll focus on more today. It doesn't have the same psychoactive properties. People will say it has no psychoactive properties, but in a sense it does, because it's said to have a lot of soothing or anti-inflammatory aspects that can reduce anxiety and a lot of different things that actually do affect the biology of a person. But just something that I wanted to note, these are not the only two chemicals that are active within the cannabis plant. There are hundreds of different chemicals interacting in the plant. It's a very complex plant in general. And THC and CBD just both happen to fall into the category of cannabinoids. So there are over 60 different cannabinoids in cannabis and hemp, but these two have gotten the most attention just in their effects on the endocannabinoid system in the human body, and through this little amount of research that does exist out there has focused largely on these. So really, hemp, taking a step back, was grown in the United States on a huge scale from the beginning. There's the pretty generally known concept that even George Washington grew hemp on his farm at Mount Vernon, and different founding fathers of the United States did the same thing, and it was used for a wide variety of uses, not necessarily smoked or used in a lot of edibles or beverages, tinctures as we see them today, but had a lot of industrial use for textiles, making rope, as well as a long history in some food applications. But over time, partially due to technology improvements and the harvesting of cotton and things like that, cotton kind of took over as a primary industrial resource for a lot of those textiles and cottons and things, and hemp kind of fell to the wayside. And then in the 70s, when the Controlled Substances Act was passed and marijuana was included as a Schedule I controlled substance, hemp was directly lumped in with marijuana, just because it is the same plant, and basically outlawed in the United States. So all agricultural production basically stopped, and it was very, very limited. And then around the 1990s, you had a variety of states that started to look into the resurgence of a potential hemp product as a agricultural issue, looking to grow it just as a good rotational crop with the various wheats and grains that a lot of farmers were already producing. And they started to put in state laws that would have allowed the growth of hemp. But there was still this obstacle of the Controlled Substances Act in the way that basically put the kibosh on any hemp growing on any state level until it was addressed federally. So the 2014 Farm Bill was one of the first ones to really direct and pass a hemp legislation, hemp appropriation bill in some fashion. It was fairly limited, so I'll kind of cover that a little bit. But the 2014 Farm Bill, so the Farm Bills are appropriation acts that kind of give money to the USDA and different areas like the SNAP program, the supplemental nutrition benefits for certain people, but it also creates a way for Congress to implement different policies and things. So the 2014 Farm Bill defined industrial hemp as the specific list, the cannabis sativa plant or any part of the plant, growing or not, with a THC concentration of no more than 0.3% on a dry weight basis. And that's the recognition that THC is the main psychoactive component of cannabis and is the aspect that is considered most like a drug. So the 2014 Farm Bill created this new definition and created a way for states to implement agricultural pilot programs. Whether it was through the State Department of Agriculture in each state, or as the bill emphasized, institutions of higher education, they were allowed to grow hemp under pilot programs to study the growth, cultivation, and marketing of industrial hemp. So one interesting aspect of that is it doesn't really say commercial production of industrial hemp. It just says marketing and studies, and it was largely based on the ability of people and states to implement pilot programs that could research hemp, partially because a lot of the growing strategies and general uses had been lost since it hadn't been grown commercially in the United States for such a long time, and just provided the opportunity to see if it was a viable crop and whether it was marketable and could be used successfully for the economic benefit of various farms. So it didn't go a whole lot further than that, and it was a little unclear on some really realistic restrictions on hemp commerce. So it didn't address whether you could transport hemp between different states. It didn't specifically address the sale of hemp or hemp products. And when you look at the definition that I showed on the previous slide, it really just talks to the overall plant and doesn't really focus on the different things you can extract from the plant and use in a huge variety of ways. And CBD is the prime example of that, the CBD extraction for use in food, beverage, dietary supplements, etc. So with the 2014 Farm Bill, a lot of states started to implement pilot programs, whether it was through a university or land grant university, and departments of agriculture started programs where private citizens could grow hemp or apply for a permit to grow hemp within the state. But like I said, there's still that kind of confusion overall on how they were going to use it in commerce in the long run. So the 2018 Farm Bill came about and was signed into law just last December by President Trump. And it had a slight variation on the definition of hemp, which provided more clarity, but also, as I'll go into in the next couple of slides, really put a program in place or the framework of a program that will allow the sale of hemp in interstate commerce and move on from there. So I've underlined the section that is added to this definition, otherwise it's the same. So not just the plant, but including the seeds, all derivatives, extracts, cannabinoids, so the CBD specifically, isomers, acid salts, and salts of isomers, as long as it still had that THC concentration of less than 0.3%. So it's still keeping that in check as far as the federal language goes, but opening up more commercial opportunity for a lot of farms. So in addition to just creating a definition and putting in a pilot program where states could elect to come into it, it specifically amended the Controlled Substance Act. So where previously marijuana was any cannabis plant as defined and listed on Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substance Act, the hemp definition that I had just showed was explicitly excluded from Controlled Schedule 1 of the CSA. And then in covering the idea that even though hemp is hemp, it could have up to a 0.3% concentration of THC, added the provision that THC in an industrial hemp plant would not be considered a drug in Schedule 1, even though components such as THC are still listed in Schedule 1 if they're part of the marijuana plant with over 0.3% THC. So in a lot of senses, if not most, this removed the Drug Enforcement Agency's oversight of hemp almost in its entirety. Previously, since the definition of hemp wasn't excluded from CSA under the 2014 Farm Bill, it made it really difficult to get seeds, and viable seeds anyway, to actually plant and use in any research project, just because you had to have DEA licenses and certificates to actually import those and grow them, and those were extremely hard to come by and quite burdensome for most people to have a chance of getting, and rarely, if ever, actually given out. So it removed a lot of those obstacles. There's still potential for DEA to be involved. They're without a doubt involved in any true cannabis product for the marijuana sense, but in the terms of hemp, unless you grow a hemp that, whether intentionally or unintentionally, exceeds the 0.3 THC threshold, they are, for the most part, outside of the scope of the entire program now. Even though it did create this overall program that did provide a fairly rigorous framework that has to be implemented by different federal agencies and states in order to have a successful hemp program in every state. So starting off, removed it from Controlled Substances Act so you don't have the DEA involvement or the interference in that sense. And then it's created a phase out of the 2014 Farm Bill so that research agricultural pilot purpose will cease to exist after a certain amount of time. They left it in place for the time being just because the 2018 Farm Bill framework hasn't been implemented by federal agencies, and they wanted to allow people who had already started the process under the 2014 Farm Bill to continue and adapt to fit into the new program. So instead of just allowing the creation of pilot programs for research, it specifically allows states and Indian tribes. That was one oversight on the 2014 Farm Bill. It didn't account for any hemp programs on tribal land. But this one specifically allows both states and Indian tribes to regulate hemp production according to in the manner in which they see fit. The USDA has to create the regulatory framework, the actual regulation that fits the Farm Bill outline, more or less, and that's a process that I'll briefly touch on in a few slides. But it also created some ways to ensure that interstate commerce in hemp wouldn't be affected by various state policies or laws. So more or less allowing you to ship hemp from Oregon to Colorado or from Kentucky to California, wherever you needed to do it for to meet your market or to have it further processed, however that worked. So there is that provision in there as well. So states and Indian tribes can still enact and enforce laws regulating the production of hemp. So a state can not create a hemp program and keep with the concept or laws that they've either had or develop new laws to more specifically prohibit the production of hemp and treat it still as a marijuana or cannabis, kind of lump them all together like it has been done historically. But they cannot block the transit of hemp through the actual state if it's produced under a state program that has been approved by the USDA. Some of the other restrictions, there is a restriction that felons are not going to be eligible to participate in hemp production. The one caveat to that is the 2014 pilot project didn't have that provision in there. So if a person who had been previously convicted of a felony was participating in the 2014 Farm Bill and is already producing hemp plant material, then they're grandfathered in to be able to participate in the 2018 Farm Bill programs as well. It also explicitly maintained the authority of the FDA, more or less. The Secretary of Human Health Services is what the regulation says, but to regulate hemp and hemp products under any applicable law that the FDA or the Secretary enforces. So most specifically, and what we'll get into here in a little bit, is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is what regulates food, drugs, dietary supplements for the most part, and everything in the United States, and is enforced by the FDA. So it also provides that hemp can be grown. So under the 2014 Farm Bill pilot program is still there, and it'll be there and accessible to anyone until the USDA establishes its hemp plan, and then they'll have to move into the 2018 Farm Bill and the USDA regulatory framework. But after that framework gets put out and the regulations get promulgated by the USDA, you'll have to have a valid USDA issue license and be operating under the USDA approved state or tribal plan for the production of hemp. So far, USDA has gone through and taken some steps to ensure that it will be possible to participate in the hemp program that was passed by the 2018 Farm Bill. Specifically, the opportunity to import seeds, viable hemp seeds for planting. Canada ends up being a huge source for these, but other countries, and especially over across the Pacific and Asia, there's lots of sources where you could get viable hemp seed. It just has to be accompanied to import with phytosanitary certificates that basically address where the seed is coming from and whether it has pest issues that is going to affect the United States. So obviously trying to keep invasive species out of the states that may be accompanying those seeds or any of the plant material. And right now, USDA's timeline is basically to have those regulations finished by this fall. That is with the idea that they'll get them all put in place, and so they'll be ready and good to go for the 2020 planting season. So we see a lot of hemp and CBD in the news now, but next year, especially after harvest, next summer, you're going to probably see on a whole different scale for USA production and availability of both the plant and CBD, since that ends up being one of the biggest money makers in terms of agricultural production of hemp, the extraction and use of CBD in so many different products. So just to say, I'll kind of just read through these ones, but the USDA draft hemp regulations, the things that the 2018 Farm Bill goes through and says that they have to address, a way to record the land that is used to produce hemp. So this will include GPS coordinates of the fields, kind of land survey issues, things like that can be maintained by the state and submitted to the USDA. Really solid procedure for testing the actual THC content. There are some issues there, since, like I said, there's so many different types of chemical and biologically active components of cannabis. THC, the Delta 9, that is listed in the definition of hemp is one type, but there's other types that, like, it's actually called a THC acid, that when the hemp is heated, the THC acid turns into actual THC, so it increases the total content of THC in the plant. So it'll be really interesting to see what the USDA comes up with to address that discrepancy, because some states and their state programs have had different interpretations or implemented different regulations on whether you test for just the actual Delta 9 THC or whether you go for total THC and include any THCA that may be converted to THC through any heating process. So included with that, if anything tests above THC, above 0.3% THC content, there's going to need to be a way to dispose of it properly, and how they're going to enforce the regulations. The Farm Bill provides a lot of specifics that it allows the USDA to hash out, but some of those involve, so if I grow a hemp product, or if I grow hemp and it ends up being above that THC threshold, what's going to happen to me? So the Farm Bill put in some prescriptions that basically says if you're not drastically over, it can be considered more or less a negligent offense, and you could even continue to participate in the hemp program under USDA and your state unless that happens multiple times. Typically, the Farm Bill kind of specifies 3 times, and then you'd be kicked out of the program for a minimum of 5 years. Random inspection of hemp producers. So using that GPS information of where all the fields are located, they jump into the idea that just like FDA does now, or USDA does in some senses, but random inspections. This doesn't mean that every single person producing hemp is going to be receiving a USDA inspection during the growing season, but it does mean that select few will be the lucky winners to have USDA show up to their farm and look over their products and potentially take some specific THC samples and just look over agricultural practices. Then just the paperwork side of the regulation, how the USDA is going to process applications from different states and tribes in order to verify that they are capable of running the program that they've created and making sure that it fits the USDA regulatory framework that's based upon the Farm Bill outline. One sec. This does not seem to be advancing. Oh, there we go. Just to touch on this one real quickly, CBD, I kind of covered over all the growing of hemp and some cannabis issues, just to say that's where CBD is coming from. It's one of the cannabinoids in hemp that has a lot of commercial interest right now, both from industry and consumers for that matter. But there are some other ways out there. There's a group in California that is basically bioengineered a yeast that can produce cannabinoids out of sugar. It's a chain process, but they've learned how to produce THC, CBD, and lots of other cannabinoids, some of which don't even exist in the actual hemp or cannabis plant, that could become a factor in the overall use of CBD in the future. The idea is that through avoiding the idea that you have to grow a plant for an entire season and then extract, and just converting straight from a sugar would be much less resource intensive and provide a more pure ingredient or product in the end as well, just because it wouldn't have to go through all the growth extraction process. So that is something to definitely watch out for. But just because it doesn't come from hemp, it doesn't mean it doesn't face the same regulatory hurdles when it comes to the FDA in drugs, dietary supplements, food and beverage. So CBD is still that component of a cannabis plant that was on the CSA, and although it's removed now, they have that obstacle of kind of demonstrating that it truly isn't from a cannabis plant, that it is hemp derived. But then within FDA's purview, so we mentioned the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act a little earlier, there's one major hiccup for the commercial production of CBD products right now, and that is that first bullet point, the actual usage in drugs. There's been some previous movement on FDA-approved drugs that use CBD and other cannabis components as active ingredients. And due to the way the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is written and FDA rules, it presents a major hurdle into the legality of using CBD in dietary supplements or food and beverage. So the one that's I'm just going to touch on briefly that is the largest hurdle to hemp-derived CBD right now is this drug, Epidiolex. So this is a drug that uses a purified form of CBD. They went through the entire process of doing clinical trials with the CBD isolated from a cannabis plant to isolate it and use it as the active ingredient in this drug that's used for the treatment of these two syndromes, Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet syndrome. And it's been approved by the FDA in a specific dose and concentration for people that are at least 2 years of age, basically. Both of these syndromes are types of epilepsy that happen to hit younger individuals very hard and cause severe seizures. And it was actually a really interesting process under which certain parents of children suffering from these symptoms actually went through the illegal market of cannabis for quite a while to find a way to isolate CBD, and ended up working with a major pharmaceutical company to find a way to get through clinical trials and allow and get this Epidiolex approved for use in the United States. There were some compassionate care uses previously because other medications weren't there, but now that this drug has been approved, it's out there, it's on the market, and it's there for anyone suffering from these two syndromes and suffering seizures. As long as they have a doctor's prescription, they can go into the pharmacy and buy it. There's a couple other drugs that use a synthetic form of THC as an active ingredient. These ones have been around for quite a bit longer, but they're used specifically for treatment of anorexia associated with weight loss in AIDS patients, which really, it's been since the 80s, 90s that this one was there. And although it's synthetic, it still is a form of THC. And there is this FDA drug exclusion rule. So it applies to both food and dietary supplements. And it basically says if there is a drug that uses an active drug ingredient that there's been substantial clinical research and that's been made public, then that active drug ingredient cannot be used in a food or dietary supplement, which basically puts a stop to the use of CBD or THC in any food or dietary supplement without some very specific action by the FDA. There's a whole lot of policy behind it, and actually having people be willing to invest in drug ingredient research and being able to investigate a new drug and whether or not it's just available over the counter in a variety of forms. So there is this drug exclusion rule that disallows the use of CBD or THC in dietary supplement or food. I'm going to focus on CBD just because THC has a lot of other components, being the fact that it's still on the Controlled Substance Act. So as I mentioned before, the THC and CBD are two of many components of cannabis. So these are the two those drugs are the ones that use components of cannabis as an active ingredient. So if someone ended up finding another component of cannabis that they wanted to start marketing immediately as a food or dietary supplement, it probably would not have the same hurdle, because As far as FDA has presented, and I know that THC and CBD are the only two components of cannabis that have undergone substantial clinical investigation that's been made available to the public. So another one could get to market before a drug company or someone develops the clinical research for a drug ingredient. There is an opportunity here, the CBD, for the FDA to create a new rule for the use of CBD in foods and dietary supplements. They haven't outlined that extremely well. There are some general issues in the fact that they've never done it before, and creating a rule at any point for the FDA takes years, at least a year at a minimum, because they have to take it through the rule proposal comment periods and consider all comments, etc. But 2 to 3 years is actually considered a fast rule promulgation at the federal level. So although the opportunity is there, it's not the best chance for immediate, I guess, approval of the use of CBD in food and dietary supplements. So the other option, and this touches a little bit about new dietary ingredients. Basically, for dietary supplements, any ingredient used that's considered a new dietary ingredient has to go through a formal approval process with the FDA, unless it was on the market as a dietary ingredient before October 15th, 1994, which is when dietary supplement regulation really came into play in the United States, as there were some concerns on some supplements out on the market that a rule for dietary supplements that addresses them specifically outside the scope of your typical conventional foods was created to make sure the ingredients used in those were safe. So there is a little bit of history in regards to ingredients that are used both in drugs and in dietary supplements. Red yeast rice was an actual thing that was, well, still is, but was used in dietary supplements starting in the 90s that produced lovastatin, which is also the active ingredient in a drug approved for helping people lower their bad cholesterol. So what happened is there ended up being a regulatory enforcement action for containing a drug ingredient in a dietary supplement. And unfortunately for this one, the dietary supplement category kind of lost. What the FDA found is that the red yeast rice supplements that contained the lovastatin had it in a level that didn't occur naturally in the red yeast rice product. So they had elevated and amplified the levels of lovastatin to a level that wasn't naturally found in the product. And it was determined that didn't go very well for the red yeast rice producers or the FDA framework. And so although the dietary supplement's still available on the market, FDA still does implement kind of testing procedures to make sure the lovastatin levels aren't at higher than naturally occurring levels, and it really put a damper on the ability of that dietary supplement to be readily marketed as something that could help reduce bad cholesterol. So it still exists, but they have to control and concentrate the lovastatin levels to make sure they're more a natural level, naturally occurring level, rather than amplified or isolated to above natural levels. So the other options, and this one's for food and not dietary supplements, there are a couple ways that hemp and CBD could typically be put into a food ingredient. The first one doesn't go over very well because so generally recognized as safe is consensus among qualified experts with widely known and available information. Sorry that the image kind of cut off one of those words, but just generally known to the public that this is safe to use in any concentration, that the information is out there in the public, and it's approved in that sense, or this GRAS determination or GRAS determination was first put into play in 1958 if the ingredient was widely used in food before 1958. It could automatically be presumed to be recognized as safe. So there's no background on having CBD for use as a specific food ingredient before 1958, just as the isolated derivative of the hemp plant. There is some history of hemp cakes and seeds and things being used in food prior to that, way prior to that, in fact, but not CBD as an individual component. So those don't work very well unless you're hiding some of that historical data somewhere. A lot of people would be very anxious to get their hands on it. So the other option is a food additive safety determination, which is a certain amount of private data submitted to the FDA, which the FDA evaluates and determines whether the ingredient would be safe for use in foods or not. This is another one that has not been done for CBD. There are some people that submitted some applications for various hemp products, but not CBD specifically. So, and these end up being the ones that even just this year, the FDA had basically said these are good to go as long as they processed and used according to this application. A company submitted a GRAS notification for whole hemp seed powder, and hemp seed oil. And what FDA does with these self-GRAS determinations is they don't necessarily say yay or nay, but they say we question this or we don't question this. So in this one, the FDA released a determination of no questions for the self-determined GRAS notification that was submitted, and said basically these products you can use in food just as these people outlined in their application, and there's no issues, no conflict with the drug exclusion rule. The big thing about this is all the THC and CBD is typically found in the flowers or buds of the hemp and cannabis plants. So if you notice, the use seed exists in all three of these products that were approved. So there's a small chance that they sometimes have a trace amount of THC or CBD, but that would typically only exist because of the incidental contact they made with the flowers or buds while being harvested and through any processing to isolate and separate the seeds that would be then ground into powder, squeezed and into oil. So while hemp products are allowed, CBD isolated products are not allowed, and would have to go through either this GRAS determination or a food additive petition. Just to touch on animal foods, all animal foods have to go to a very similar additive petition or GRAS. The Association of American Feed Control Officials puts out a publication, an official publication, that basically lists all the products that are approved for use as ingredients in foods. And they have not listed any hemp products in an animal food, and specifically have not listed any CBD as an approved use for animal or pet food. So this is just an example that I find a little bit interesting, that a component or an active ingredient that can exist across all three categories. Everyone knows about fish oil, and these are three different levels. So there are some components of fish oil that are active ingredients in drugs that lower a person's triglycerides. So those individual components are not used in a dietary supplement or food, but they're isolated from fish oil, which is readily available in dietary supplement form, or in a even lesser concentrated form, just focusing on eating the fish that may contain or have high amounts of omega-3 fatty acids, and I have some of them listed there. So it's not out of the picture that a CBD product could be seen across all three categories of food, drug, and dietary supplement, but concentrations and isolations of the CBD may affect FDA's overall determination in that regard. So I just went through this entire concept of why CBD is illegal in food, dietary supplements, and beverages, but I'm sure everyone's thinking, well, I can buy this anywhere. It's all over the place. It's on the internet, it's in my convenience store, it's at the grocery store. There's CBD products all over the place, hemp oil products all over the place. And even though they're technically illegal per FDA regulations and FDA statements, FDA has a really lax history of actually enforcing regulations on these. They've really reserved it for times when there are very direct claims, basically drug claims that prevent, diagnose, treat, cure diseases. And these are typically ones that are marketed as dietary supplements or CBD added to food products that claim to have additional benefits that go to the level of a drug claim. So there is some FDA enforcement, although it isn't that robust of an enforcement program. The overall concept on top of the warning letters for different label claims is if there were a CBD product that turned out to be adulterated, that made people sick, you can bet the FDA would step in very quickly to protect public health and get that product off the market and penalize whatever company was producing it however they could. So as I kind of mentioned, state regulations for hemp, they're all over the place. They're being implemented with the 2018 Farm Bill. Research, Commerce Confusion is still out there a little bit, but every single state except for Idaho, South Dakota, and Mississippi have implemented hemp cultivation programs. So over the next while, we will see a lot more. There's a little map provided by the Cannabis Business Times that kind of demonstrates real quickly some states don't go for the cannabis side, but they're fine with the CBD side, whether it be medicinal or other. They are creating ways for the citizens of those states to purchase CBD products or full-on cannabis products within those states, and really moving forward there. South Dakota, Kansas, and Idaho are the ones a little bit farther behind the rest of the states in that. So state regulations on CBD food takes an angle that's pretty similar to how different states are enacting recreational and medicinal marijuana laws, and they're all over the place. So Colorado is one of the states that's really at the forefront of almost any of these issues involving cannabis. They explicitly allow the use of CBD in food on any level that's sold within that state. California does not currently allow, but the legislature is really kind of pushing to allow CBD for the use in food. There is some history of the Los Angeles Health Authority on its local jurisdictions taking enforcement action in California, or saying they would. But there is still an option for California to allow that through legislative means. And then Washington is one that's a little conflicting because they have a medical cannabis program that would allow you to have a CBD product, but it's only sold through their medical dispensaries or even sometimes their recreational dispensaries. But the State Department of Agriculture that regulates all the food and dietary supplement production in the state says CBD is not allowed in food. So it really kind of depends on the state and which regulatory body you're dealing with in the state. So one other example of that is New York. They released some guidance that allowed and said CBD was good to go in dietary supplements, but then the New York City Health Department came in and went through and enforced and embargoed food and drink from coffee shops and grocery that could have contained CBD and forced it to be returned to the producer or destroyed in a lot of sense. So even within a state to state can vary, but state to local enforcement agency in a state can vary too. So you really have to be kind of aware of what you're dealing with in each of those situations. So just in closing, I wanted to say a few of the things that are really important in this area. Like I said, there are all these legal gray areas, but the product's out there and congressional intent, everything is pushing FDA in general to find a way to regulate this and make it more available to your general consumer. So first and foremost is supply chain controls. Just because hemp or CBD specifically is available on the market doesn't mean it was produced legally. And on top of that, even if it was produced legally, there could be potency issues that you could get yourself into trouble too. So with anything over that 0.3% THC could present real issues. There are growing and manufacturing practices that you'd have to look into within supply chains just due to the possibility of aflatoxin growth and things and agricultural products that aren't dried properly, and then shipping and transportation considerations. Where are you shipping it from? Where is it crossing? Although the 2018 Farm Bill allows for interstate transit, there have been some issues with state police seizing cargo loads of hemp, and kind of in the long run, the hemp companies are probably going to win out, but it's a huge obstacle and issue when they have their product detained and held and loses its potency, shelf life, quality, all of that while it's going through testing programs in the state to verify whether it's hemp or marijuana. So that can be addressed through a variety of programs and selected routes for the time being, and hopefully will become clearer and easier once the USDA has all the hemp program regulations in place and formalized. After that, when you're actually producing dietary supplements, foods, or beverages, or animal foods, it's not an FDA requirement right now necessarily in a lot of states, but I guess in a sense it is, to make sure you're actually following the FDA rules, even if you're not on their radar specifically right now, whether you're operating within a state program or not. You should be looking to the best industry practice in implementing these programs to address hazards that may exist in dietary supplements and foods, because although you're operating in a state program now, it's eventually going to be an FDA area of concentration. So labeling, just don't make drug claims on the products. Here's a list of some of the very obvious examples, but these are directly from FDA warning letters, that things that are labeled on CBD products. And it's not just the actual product label, it's anything you say online, on social media or anything. These are all considered labeling and advertising for FDA and FTC purposes, and they will look through all of them and issue warning letters if they think you're making improper drug claims. So where are we going next? State programs are going to continue to be the legal area for now. Congress is pushing for formal enforcement discretion by FDA, so there's a little more clarity on what actually applies. And FDA is working as hard as they can to get rules in place, but they have some considerations for public health and everything. So we'll see how that goes. But right now, there is a little bit of a wait and see aspect to it, where FDA is slow moving, but they need to be thorough. They need to consider if someone's going to have CBD products with their butter on their toast in the morning and then have gummy snacks in the afternoon and have a relaxing CBD beverage in the evening. If you're taking CBD from all these different areas, is there going to be a public health risk or risk of toxicity? So next, for an overall business practice, just clarifying exactly what may be in your product, whether you're providing full spectrum, which kind of provides everything in the plant, versus broad spectrum, which typically provides part of the chemical components of the plant, but may exclude something like THC specifically. So they have a 0% THC content, whereas CBD isolate is just that CBD on its own, versus just a general hemp oil. which could be full or broad spectrum. So these are some terms that are pretty regularly used in the industry with a lot of consumers they're confused about. So eventually this will become one of those areas where if you're labeling and selling something that you're not really selling, then there's the potential for consumers to file lawsuits outside of the typical FDA regulatory action for misleading them. So just that's kind of the general idea. I think I took all the time, so I'll turn it back to Brian, and we can get to questions some other time. But thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I know we had a ton of stuff that you put in there, and definitely appreciate it, Eric, because I think you can see how much there is to cover, and I think we probably just scratched the surface, and this is why there is so much confusion. So as we mentioned at the top, we'll make the deck available, and it was put together in a way to also be kind of a reference tool for you as we try and wrap our hands around all this together as an industry. I know some of you want to go and want to respect your time. I think one question that came in at the end that I think is kind of an interesting one, because you finished up there talking a lot about, what companies should be thinking about right now. And, from your stance, do you anticipate, the question really is around, do you expect that there's kind of be a fallout, if you will, of companies because they don't have those CFR standards in place kind of once all this gets in place from the FDA?
Yeah, I think they're not necessarily a fallout, but yeah, as soon as FDA really takes an active role in inspecting a lot of these companies that are kind of just not putting in programs and they're just producing and capitalizing on the market demand right now, they're going to be hit with some real issues. And then the whole fact that if you do make someone sick, it will a good chance it will be because you don't have that sort of program in place, and that will be devastating to a company.
Right. Yeah. No, thanks, Russell, for that question. And I think it's going to be interesting to watch, and certainly on everyone's minds. And we're out there working with a lot of customers that are starting to do this and prepare. A follow-up stat that came in from Albert was, do you expect that there'll be GFSI compliance required essentially for these manufacturers?
Well, that will be dependent entirely on the industry. In a sense, GFSI is a great third-party auditing scheme that a lot of customers demand of their suppliers. And as you see bigger players get involved in the market, for example, most major grocery store chains that I'm aware of require anyone supplying product to their private label or even to their shelves have a GFSI scheme certification. Yeah. And so you'll see those become bigger. There's already some involvement in the food aspect of cannabis production, not in all the extraction forms, just because they're still focusing on the manufacturing level. But yeah, I think that will become more prominent as the industry grows.
Yeah, and we're seeing that, just to speak from our side in terms of compliance and people wanting to be prepared. We're definitely seeing an interest in making sure they have all that in line for sure. I want to respect everyone's time. I know we're a few minutes over. I do have a question for you, though, and these are just things that come up as we talk to customers and potential customers. If someone is already, in food processing, manufacturing, have all these great practices in place, but they're thinking about going to market with CBD, factoring all the stuff you gave in, what advice would you give, or what considerations should they be factoring in? I know you touched on some specifics to be thinking about, but what generally is that conversation like for you when you guys are talking to someone in that position?
A lot of that focuses on their actual supply chain controls. Just with the way that CBD is out there and some of the regulatory risk and transport right now, a lot of those larger companies that are exploring CBD production or CBD food production, they have a lot of good programs in place, but there is a different industry that is accustomed to dealing with them, that you sometimes have to hold their hand a little bit to make sure they have programs in place so their ingredients that they're supplying to you don't affect your finished product in a detrimental way.
Right.
So a lot of it ends up being those supply chain issues.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. It's always the largest area of risk, and certainly in this situation, I think it's going to become more important. Eric, thank you. This has been great, and I know we're going to need more follow up on this, and we'll start digging more into the application side once some of these things start to change. But I think this was a good heads up on particularly the regulations and some of the things that have been confusing out there. As I mentioned, we'll make this available as a recording and the deck here in the coming days, so keep an eye out for that. Also want to remind you that we do have a full resource center, including all of our FSMA Friday presentations, including the one Eric did on CBD back in January for us as well. So if there's anything we can help provide you in terms of resources, let us know. We're also always excited to talk to folks who want to talk about technology and how to make compliance in situations like this a heck of a lot easier, let alone helping you with yield and throughput and just your continuous improvement in all of your facilities. So thank you all for continuing to be part of the community and joining us today. We hope that you found it helpful, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again next month. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Brian.